And we are back. That's great. So it's Thursday morning in Berlin. It's 9:30 a.m. Central European summertime. And it's Space Cafe time, what is absolutely fantastic. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to another episode of our Space Cafe Geopolitics, 33 minutes with Professor Steven Freeland about UN COPUOS, a forum for multilateral consensus on space governance, but well, at least most of the time. And we will tell you more about it. As always, we truly value your participation and ongoing feedback. We are committed to learning from your input and continuously improving our webinars to make them more engaging and informative for you. And I'm Torsten, the publisher of SpaceWatch.Global, a Europe-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. Allow me to thank all of our Business Club members for their support. That always allows us to keep our independent journalism alive. We really appreciate that. And if you want to know how to join our Business Club, just see the banner below. It's just a click away if that works. We are doing it here today with a very small team, but we hope we get everything right. And if everything works well, then Rika will have sent the link into the chat for all of you. I know many of you are familiar with our website, our weekly and our daily newsletters, and our new Nobody Cares About Your Satellite Space Communication newsletter by Dr. Amagati, our editor-in-chief, and our Space Cafe podcast. So don't miss this brand new episode, number 107. It's called CERN's Pablo Tello and ESA's Ian Canelli, Mind Collider, Fusion Space, Physics, and Big Ideas, with our wonderful host, Markus Moslechner. And he ran an experiment on YouTube, just on YouTube, an interview with a mountaineer, a world-class mountaineer, to talk about how to climb on Jupiter's Mount Io. It's absolute fun to watch. It's only on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and it's pretty cool. So to talk with a professional about how potentially to climb a mountain on another celestial body. And I'm quite sure, Steven, you will tell me later on, yes, it's possible, or no, he shouldn't do that. Okay, but all the links should be here in the chat as well. We have also new episodes on our Space Cafe Radio. So with iSpace CEO Takeshi Hakamada, what we recorded as the Space Symposium. And you can find all our audio services where you get your podcasts from. So, and if you want to become a space watcher, visit our fan shop on our website. And if you've missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our webpage in the event section, and you can also find us on YouTube. And as Emma would say, okay, we are done with the ads. Let's finally start. So for that, I change that, and no, that's not the right one. That's not the right one. Where's the right one? Where's Steven? Here's Steven. Steven, hey, I made it. I made it. It took a moment. Okay, sorry for that.
No problem. Hi.
So, as always, I am super excited for our events, but today I'm even more excited to have a very good friend and someone I admire for his outstanding work on our show. A very warm welcome, Professor Steven Freeland. It's very great to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Hey, Torsten. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be on this new, super impressive platform that you've got here. And it's great that many people are interested in space governance. You've had so many good speakers and so many good interviews, but thanks for asking me, and hopefully we can shed a bit more light on space governance as we go. So I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, my first question to you, even offside our script here. Do you remember when we had our first 33 minutes?
We did. It was during COVID. I remember that. So
okay, that's a fair assessment.
Quite, yeah. I mean, a lot of things were during COVID, of course. Yes, we spoke a long time ago, and
4 years almost.
my
4
goodness.
years.
Yeah,
20,
but since
24th
what?
of November 2020.
Wow. But since then, we've together, you and I have developed a nice little platform, the Space Café Law Breakfast, and we've had some wonderful people. We've had a little break in that, but we'll be back in July with Space Café Law Breakfast, you and I, and we'll have great people as always to talk about some specific legal and policy aspects, and that are relevant also for space governance. So yes, from little things, bigger things grow.
Great things will become. So for all of you listeners who doesn't know Steven, a few words about your very impressive career. As I mentioned, he is a professor of international law at the Western Sydney University, and before becoming an academic, he had a decade-long career as an international commercial lawyer and an investment banker. So what I think is an absolute cool combination. And he has been appointed by UN COPUOS to co-chair the working group on multilateral discussions on the exploration, exploitation, and utilization of space resources. And we will talk about that as well. And he is the co-principal of the specialized space firm Azimuth Advisory, a director of the International Institute of Space Law, and a member of the Space Law Committee of both the International Bar Association and the International Law Association. And there's so much more. But most important for me, he is a wonderful person to work with. And I say that as a co-host of the, as mentioned by you before, the Space Café Law Breakfast with Steven Freeland, which runs almost every second month for many years now. So let's kick it off.
Okay, thank you.
Once more, Steven, welcome. Let's kick it off and set the scene. 3 weeks ago, I talked with Dr. Jessica West of Project PlugShares about the Russian veto at the UN Security Council. And we talked about the ISA test and potential nukes in space. At the same time, as our conversation went on, the Legal Subcommittee at UN COPUOS took place in Vienna. And with you, I like to talk about the work of UN COPUOS and your work at COPUOS and the current state of space governance. Many words so far from my end. So how is it going?
It's a great question. Yes, how's it going? It's complicated. You know, that's probably the short answer. But there are many.
But it's not your Facebook status, right?
No, that's certainly not complicated. There's many things going on, and yeah, I saw your interview with Jessica, and of course the situation in terms of, if I may put it, the security related aspects of space are in a state of flux is probably not the right expression, but certainly on the tip of the tongue of many commentators. And I think that's really important. I mean, my view on space governance, which is and the security of space and the way we govern that, is obviously part of an even broader picture. My view on space governance is that it is complicated. It is complex, but there are many facets to it as well. So if we just take a step back, because we'll talk a bit about COPUOS, but let's take a step back and look at the institutional arrangements to govern space. So we have, by and large, 2 United Nations organizations or agencies that deal with matters to do with space. We have in Vienna the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. I'm assuming most of the listeners will know what that is, but I'm happy to give a little brief description of what that is. But Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space was established in 1959. It's met every year since about 1962, and it deals with so many issues. In Geneva, we have another UN body that people will know now as the Conference on Disarmament, which, as part of its mandate, deals also with security and, if I may say, military and weapons related issues in space. And so when this UN system was established, it was established on an assumption, which essentially is a false assumption. But the assumption was this, that if you're looking at a space activity and trying to work out then how do we govern it, govern it. That activity, if it's peaceful, it's either peaceful and we send that down to COPUOS in Vienna and Vienna will work out a governance framework, or it's something else and we send that down to Geneva and the Conference of Disarmament. And so there was this bifurcation, this assumption that space activities were either one or the other and they wouldn't coalesce. Now, we all know that that is a false assumption. We all know that's inaccurate because space is capable of being, and indeed is, what many regard as an area for dual use activities. What do we mean by that? We mean that an asset, let's say owned and operated by a private organization for commercial gain, so they want to make money, of course, and that at the same time, that satellite, part of its capacity, part of its usage could be for civil, commercial, scientific purposes, and at the same time, part of its usage could be for, if you like, military uses or for the use of military. And so that is quite common. What is also quite common is that because the security aspects of space are so much in the limelight, and I'm here to say that's obviously important, but there are many other aspects of space as well that we need to govern. But the security aspects are so important. Governments, by and large, need space more and more and more and more. They need it to support their critical infrastructure. They need it to support their national security interests. The governments in many countries wanting, with this thirst for more and more space, and we all understand how space can be an enabler in so many things, but the governments themselves do not have the capacity, the wherewithal, the smarts necessarily, the money, the flexibility to, if you like, maximize the usage of technology as the technology evolves. So governments are, in many countries, not all, more and more using the private sector for their own purposes, which again includes national security related interests. And so we have this bifurcation, we have these two bodies based on an assumption that doesn't reflect the reality of space. And what's worse is that we all know that the CD, the Conference of Disarmament, which is mandated as part of its work to look at the security-related aspects of space, is logjammed. It's at a stalemate. They have extreme difficulty moving beyond trying to argue how the agenda might look. And that sounds a bit disparaging, but certainly it's very, very difficult, if nigh impossible now, to get a view on substantive issues that is addressed in an appropriate way at the CD. And so you have this division, you have important aspects going to Geneva, you have Geneva unable to cope with it, you have the things in Vienna that is within the mandate of COPUOS, but of course interact with security-related issues, because of course security-related issues are relevant to all space activities to a certain degree, and that you have a relatively restricted mandate in COPUOS, which doesn't allow a full discussion. Everybody says, well, that's not part of the mandate of COPUOS, it belongs in another forum, meaning the CD, but we know the CD can't work at it. And so you have this institutional problem. That's not necessarily a deal breaker, because slowly but surely we're finding in COPUOS that the discussions are becoming more and more robust. I've had the privilege of being part of the Australian delegation for about 15 years, and you can see that year on year, the discussion at COPUOS is broadening to try to encompass the reality of space, this dual use nature, that if you're going to talk about debris mitigation, if you're going to talk about space traffic management, if you're going to talk about resources, that obviously involves security related issues. So the discussion is broadening, but we always have this institutional barrier where some states say, I'm sorry, we've gone too far, we can't talk about it here, it belongs somewhere else. And that's a circular argument, but that's not to say that COPUOS is not effective most of the time. Clearly, that's why I wanted to have this program, to say that there are positive things going on, notwithstanding all of the challenges.
And we will come to that relevance later on. But thank you very much for this positive intro. And I get its complicated status. And I mean, we talked about how countries behave with Jessica West, always with Victoria Sampson on the open-ended working group and so on. But talking with experts, especially in the disarmament sector, it's always something that is very special. Even as Jessica West, as we all know her, is a very positive person. Yeah, but again, you said it's complicated. And on that day, today, we are celebrating here in Germany, if we want to call it a celebration, the 25th anniversary, no, not the 20th, the 75th anniversary of our German constitution. So
congratulations.
The Grundgesetz. Also something you highly can debate about. Is it outdated? Is it not? Does it can keep up with the reality that we are facing in the world or not? But it is what we have. So coming back to the UN Security Council, what is your view on this veto of Russia in the UN Security Council and the follow-up and the what we saw then the week after in the UNGA? If you can describe it a bit from your point of view.
Yeah, look, it's obviously unfortunate that there isn't the ability to gain a clear consensus amongst the Security Council on issues that are so fundamental as stating that, reinforcing the centrality of the Outer Space Treaty, which, by the way, came from COPUOS, as did all of the treaties. So, hence, what COPUOS does is relevant for a whole range of other issues, including security related. But I digress. It's unfortunate that we didn't get the consensus. And of course, much has been made of the fact that Russia vetoed and China abstained. And, there's obviously a lot of political comment. And I won't comment on the political comment because that's not why I'm here. What is true is this, that the fundamental frameworks we have deal with certain aspects of disarmament, if that's the right expression, of space. But the Outer Space Treaty and the framework that was established is not a disarmament treaty. It was developed at a time when the Cold War was going on, where the protagonists of the Cold War understood, because nobody knew exactly who was going to win that quote-unquote space race. They understood the dangers of a proliferation of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction in space, but they didn't go so far as to specifically say that we should have no weapons in space. Why? Because there were only two countries at the time that really were major powers, and they took the view, one would assume, that why would we restrict ourselves unnecessarily on developing our technology, particularly because we don't necessarily believe what the other side is saying, So, but if you look at the whole spirit of the framework of the Outer Space Treaty, and every country, again and again and again, at the security side, at the peaceful side, always reinforce the centrality of those principles. So they are relevant for everything. And if you look at the way the Outer Space Treaty is framed, if you look at the spirit, if you look at the multiple references to peace and peaceful uses and cooperation and mutual assistance and peaceful purposes and a due regard and all of those issues, it is quite clear that the centrality of the Outer Space Treaty system points towards a lessening and avoidance of really aggressive military weapon type activities in space. So we have specific restrictions on specific types of weapons, but it goes further than that. Some people just look at Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty and say, well, hey, it specifically prevents certain type of weapons being placed. That means I can do anything else. Well, that's too simplistic a reading. Because you've got to read everything in context. You've got to read the whole treaty. You've got to read and understand it. And there are rules about how you read treaties. That said, it is unfortunate that there wasn't a reinforcement about the Outer Space Treaty and the specific prevention of the placement of nuclear weapons. In the context, though, and again, I'm not making any political statement, but just restating a fact. In the Conference of Disarmament, already in 2008, another proposal was put forward. It was sponsored by China and Russia, and some people might be skeptical, some people not, about the motivations behind that. But it was a draft of a treaty that purports, and of course there are many flaws with it, but it purports to ban all weapons in space. And that proposal, which was then revisited and updated in 2014, still sits essentially in this logjam that I described at the Conference of Disarmament. And so you have differing views. Should we try to establish a way of banning all types of weapons, notwithstanding the difficulties of verification, the difficulties of definition? But hey, that's what lawyers are for. That's what diplomats are for, to find a way forward. Or do we just focus on the specific prohibition, and in a sense, bypass the broader aspects of space? And, I'm not saying one way or the other is correct, but it's, as I said before, it's complicated. The fact, though, that we didn't have consensus in the Security Council is unfortunate. No matter what view you take about the way forward for dealing with weapons in space, we've got a movement. Every year the General Assembly, it's reinforced many times at COPUOS. Is a notion of PAROS, prevention of an arms race in outer space. Everybody supports that. Everybody supports that idea, and yet, we still have disagreement about whether we should be banning weapons, whether we should be, reinforcing what the Outer Space Treaty says. PAROS is good. It's a wonderful start. My own personal view, and this is purely a personal view, is it's not enough. We almost need to be rethinking the way space is from a weapons-related issue, and start talking about not only the prevention of an arms race, but the promotion of a peace race in space. Now, of course, people will roll their eyes and say, you don't understand, space is so important to security. The reality is, if we continue the rhetoric, if we continue to think that space is an area where we can weaponize, if we continue to think that it's inevitable that we'll have a war in space, so we've got to weaponize ourselves there to be ready for it, it's not inevitable. It's not inevitable. And if it happens, it's a disaster. And it's not just a disaster for the large countries that would be engaged, it's a disaster for humanity as a whole. And, it's a question of approach to these things, which is why this bifurcation, saying, well, there are security-related matters, let the military people sort it out, and of course they can't agree. And then there's everything else, some of the really incredibly positive things that space does for us, which a lot of which is dealt with in COPUOS. But space gives rise to so many benefits. And yet if we don't find an amalgamated and common interest perspective to space, then, we can screw it up rather badly. And if we screw it up rather badly, the consequences are massive.
Absolutely. No, we will not talk about debris and all the pressing issues that we have. But I mean, on that context, we have seen in the last days Russian satellites that were launched to follow American reconnaissance satellites. I mean, this kind of behavior is scary, and that also that will be my next question to you. And before we diving into your work at COPUOS, did the diplomatic tonality change, or is there a pattern of state behaviors at the international consensus set for us that we can observe?
Oh, it's really tough. This, finding consensus amongst countries is difficult at the best of times, right? In COPUOS, for example, we have 102 member states. That's 102 countries with 102 different histories, cultures, values, economies, industries, expectations, risk profiles. They all have different ideas, and yet we need to find consensus. So doing that at the best of times is extremely difficult. We are certainly, for reasons that everybody is aware, certainly not in the best of times. These are extremely difficult, tense, worrying geopolitical times that we are in. And there are conflagrations going around the globe in different ways, some of them very high profile, some of them under the radar, but still also very, very worrying. And so I always, in a sense, the role of us at the working group is to find consensus. And I always say it's trying to find consensus in a non-consensus world. And it gets harder and harder and harder. It gets harder because of the times. It gets harder, of course, because COPUOS is growing. So you're getting more and more states. The more there are, the more complicated, even more the consensus process goes. And yet, most of the time, hence, the little qualification on the name of this discussion, most of the time, COPUOS, at least, has been successful in getting consensus on really important issues with progress. Ironically, just at this moment, we're in a difficult position because we weren't able to get consensus at Legal Subcommittee on the report. But that was on, whilst it was an important issue for the relevant states, that was on an issue that essentially had nothing to do with the way of the world at the moment, in one sense. We can talk about that it's really sort of a micro issue, although it's important. But, at COPUOS, we are getting consensus on really difficult issues. Of course, consensus is a compromise. Of course, consensus happens only after you have sometimes very difficult discussions. Of course, it means that we've all got to have 100 cups of coffee on the fringes of any meeting to try to, in the background, maneuver. But COPUOS has been, and I'm not an apologist for COPUOS, there are many problems, many issues. But if you look at the output of COPUOS, the security people always talk about the Outer Space Treaty. As I said, that came from COPUOS, as did all of the treaty framework, as did all of the other instruments. They all came from COPUOS. COPUOS has produced, albeit that it's a UN process, and the UN process has inherent flaws and inherent difficulties and inherent delays. But so getting consensus is difficult. And of course, the question is, has the behavior of states changed? One thing I've learned in the work that I do, you have to listen to all the voices, you have to respect all the voices, but sometimes those voices are not necessarily incredibly, totally rational. States will have views for reasons that sometimes you do not understand or that don't appear rational on their face. Remembering that, these views that are expressed, the discussions that take place, the people in the room in Vienna and in Geneva, recognizing that Geneva is logjam, but in Vienna, those people will get their instructions from capital, from, the relevant ministry in their back at home. And sometimes, a view on space is decided upon or not, but decided upon for reasons that have got nothing to do with space or nothing to do with the actual issue, because international relationships are so much broader than just one or two or three issues. So sometimes, as we're moving towards consensus and the discussions are going well, and then out of the blue, somebody will raise something out of left field. And you think, why? What is going on? And it's only when you sit down and you reflect on it and you have a discussion with that delegation, you realize that, well, they're saying that because they want something over here, or they've got a problem with this delegation on this issue or something like that. And 9 times out of 10, we're able to solve those issues. Unfortunately, at the most recent Legal Subcommittee, we weren't able to solve that on a one particular issue. But, we just have to find a way through that.
We will jump on that immediately. So, but for all our listeners, if you're wondering, hey, these guys are on the 33 minutes already in a 33-minute program, don't worry. 33 minutes is just the brand. So we take the liberty to even run it further because it's a very important and absolutely interesting discussion that I think we can offer here. So, Steven, tell us a bit about your work as the vice chair of the working group on space resources at COPUOS. I mean, that is in its own a very sensitive topic. So what is this working group? Who's in there? And what is the goal? Maybe you can summarize that a bit for us.
Absolutely. So amongst many issues, one of the issues of great interest and which falls also within the mandate of COPUOS is the idea that at some future point, many states, and through them some of their corporates are interested in the idea of exploiting the resources on the moon and other celestial bodies, for example. Yeah, and for a long time, that idea was of interest already in the 1970s, leading to, through COPUOS again, the conclusion by consensus of the terms of the Moon Agreement. Now, many of you in the audience will know the Moon Agreement is not heavily subscribed, but that's not necessarily to, the terms were agreed by consensus. It's just political lobbying and political decisions not to ratify. But there was interest already then in this possibility of exploiting resources. For various reasons, the moon became unsexy, and this idea became unsexy. It's now sexy again. And many countries, also driven by the private sector in many countries, are now looking at this as a real possibility. There are many arguments for it from a commercial perspective, from a humanity perspective, from a scientific perspective, from a technical perspective, from a cultural perspective. All of those things come into the mix. And gradually, this is an issue that has become now the focal point, or a major focal point of COPUOS. So, say 15 years ago, I recall one delegation actually mentioned the idea of exploiting resources. And 15 years ago, that delegation was widely criticized at COPUOS, as far as diplomatic language would allow, for saying, well, we're not even talking about exploitation. That's a thing that we're not interested in. We shouldn't do. Remnants of perhaps the reluctance to join up to the Moon Agreement, perhaps. And then everything changed in 2015. The United States, through lobbying by various companies, enacted some legislation that promotes within US national law space resource activities, although it always says subject to US international obligations. That led to quite robust discussion at COPUOS in 2016 about, is one country being unilateral in its interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty? There was a lot of disagreement. And then the way COPUOS works is that if an issue becomes something they really want to discuss in earnest, by consensus, they agree to put it on as what's called an agenda item. And so the idea of the exploration, exploitation, and utilization of space resources becomes an agenda item in 2017. And then if COPUOS wants to move from an agenda item, which, let's say, is a discussion point, a discussion item of seriousness, but if COPUOS wants to move from a discussion point, a discussion item, to, if you like, an action item, the member states, again by consensus, would establish a working group. A working group is not 2 or 3 people. A working group is the 102 member states, but that is the modality, if you like, COPUOS. So in 2021, after a few iterations, the member states agreed to establish a working group, which is called the Working Group on Legal Aspects of Space Resource Activities. I was honoured by being asked and appointed by COPUOS to be the vice chair of that working group. My dear friend and colleague, Ambassador Andrzej Michtal from Poland, who has been on our Space Law Café in the past, is the chair. So we then spent time getting, by consensus, at multiple meetings with all of the member states, a 5-year mandate. The states agree what our mandate is, what our action plan is, and we then have to work to it. All decisions are made by the member states. Our job as chair and vice chair, or co-chairs, if you like, is to drive the discussion, follow the mandate, move, put drafts together, encourage, have intersessionals, bring it all together. So what is our mandate in very general terms? Is to find out, firstly, what's real, because there's so much hype about the possibility of space resources. I know, Torsten, you've spoken to many people. If you listen to everything that's being said, this is going to happen tomorrow. Well, it's not going to happen tomorrow. We understand that. So we need to work out what's real. For that purpose, we've had a number of conferences, again, mandated by the member states, where member states have invited scientists and engineers and archaeologists and others to tell the member states, the current state of technology, what's possible, what's real, etc. So we need to work out what's real. We need to examine, as part of our mandate, this is the member states, and we are driving the discussion, what the current legal framework says. And the current legal framework, embodied by the Outer Space Treaty and other treaties, embodied by some of the other instruments perhaps, has a lot to say already that is relevant to any future space resource activities. So we need to work out exactly what the current framework says, and we've been working on that. We need to work out, therefore, are there gaps, given what is real, what's possible, and given what the current law says, are there gaps? Are there, if you like, regulatory gaps? If so, is there a benefit to fill those gaps? Clearly, if there are gaps, and clearly if these activities are happening, there's a benefit to fill that. If so, we start talking about what those gaps are and how we fill it. And then the member states have asked the working group, but remember, the working group is the member states, just through a different modality. We have to come up with a set of initial principles that will lay the foundations for any future space resource activities. And that has to be agreed by 2027. Now, you might think that's a long way away. It's going to take a long time to negotiate that. We, the chair and vice chair, have the privilege of preparing what we call a zero draft of those principles. We'll be doing that over the course of this year. And then the member states will take that draft, and we'll have robust discussions. We'll have much amendment. We'll have many inputs from member states who have their own views. And at the end of that, hopefully we will come out with these principles endorsed by consensus by COPUOS, by the working group, and then even perhaps sent to the General Assembly as well. And then the last part of our mandate, having done all of this, we have to work out what's next. What's next? And member states will decide, well, okay, we've got these principles, that sets the scene. Do we need more? Do we need a much more detailed instrument? Do we need, and whatever way, shape, or form does that take? Do we need a regulatory body? I mean, in the end, of course, you and I, Torsten, and everybody in the room has their own personal views about what is the best way forward. In the end, 102 states, remembering that they have to agree by consensus, and they all have differing views, will decide what's next, if anything. And we'll just see how we go. So it sounds like it's a slow process. We've made, actually, I think, humbly, remarkable progress, given, as you say, how political, strategic, contested this whole issue of space resources is. And everybody is aware of the various groupings of countries, the various interests, the idea that, we want to be first, we want to be best, we want to be biggest, we want to do this, etc. The commercial considerations, the environmental considerations, everybody's aware of how complicated this is. And yet we are making remarkable progress. That's not to say there aren't difficulties ahead. Of course there will be. Sure. But it's a systematic way forward. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And thank you for this clarification. And I mean, as we are having almost 60 people now here watching us, please keep your great questions coming in. We will work on them later on, potentially in the third of our 33-minute sections. No, but I listened to everything you said, and also the positive note underneath that. So, do you see signals for a consensus on your working group, or, I mean, you just came back from the Legal Subcommittee in spring this year, and there was a positive vibe. And then, as you mentioned before, just before the finish line, something happened. Someone came in, complete different topic, and suddenly it was. Is that again coming back to the pattern? Is that a way forward to just put all these discussions on a timeline, on a longer?
It's a really good question. Firstly, on the first part, one has to be optimistic, but realistic. States have, by and large, have been very supportive of the work of the working group. Why? Because I think those that are interested recognize that it probably makes sense to have one set of common understandings, given that there might be different groupings engaged in similar activities in close geographic proximity in hazardous conditions. It's much better that we have where everybody's working under the same rule book. If they're not, that gives rise to a greater risk of misunderstandings and miscalculations. So at the moment, yes, we see positives, but of course, we have to agree on the detail. These principles will be very broadly discussed, and many will disagree, and anything can happen. One has to be very cautiously optimistic, but cautiously so. Consensus is really difficult, particularly because of the world we live in. On the second part of the question, is this a pattern of states? Well, let me put it this way. I've already described the logjam at the Conference on Disarmament, and frankly, that's terrible. That's terrible for all of us, because there are some incredibly pressing issues that wouldn't it be wonderful if they could be discussed in an open, transparent way, and better still, that some rational conclusions are reached. So it's terrible that it's logjam. It would, in my opinion, be a disaster if COPUOS also followed that and became logjam. And of course, because all decisions are made by consensus, anything is possible. And I don't believe this is the case, but if a state or number of states took the view that, it would be in their strategic and geopolitical interest to block things at COPUOS, that's possible. Just like we see veto rights in the Security Council, because of the structure of the Security Council. At COPUOS, everything is consensus. So this is not accurate, but in theory, every one of those 102 countries has the power of veto. That I wouldn't put it that way publicly. I mean, I am, but you get the idea, right? So anything is possible, but it would be a disaster if there was a calculation to logjam COPUOS as well, because COPUOS is a great hope, notwithstanding its challenges. It's a great hope because it deals with so many things that are crucial for humanity and so many challenges that we need to overcome if we are to continue, not only for this generation, but let's say for 7+ generations going forward, as our Australian Indigenous First Nations people look forward. They look forward 7+ years, 7+ generations. If we are to allow us to garner benefits in an appropriate way, a sustainable way, COPUOS has to be able to function, notwithstanding its challenges. And as I say, ideally, it would be great if the CD does function in a more systematic way. But politics is politics, and space. We talk about governance and law and rules and norms and guidelines, but of course, space is also, amongst a whole range of other things, highly, highly political and highly, highly geopolitical. And, we just have to live in that context and make the best of it to maximize benefits, minimize risks.
I hear you. And I'm tempted to put my reality check.
Your famous reality check. I love it.
to lead into my next question, and that will be, I'm taking the question before, is COPUOS still relevant? Why I want to bring up this question? I mean, I heard everything you said, and I agree with you, and I'm a positive thinking human that wants to do that we come out with the best for humanity, whatever we can do with space. And being member of the Hague Working Group on Space Resources in the previous years where we set the building blocks as an proposal, I think I'm well informed in this topics. But what I see at the moment, and that's happens in parallel to all the UN activities, are setting facts. We are in a technological age where we have space forces around the world to protect the tradeways. Tradeways means resources, installations, in whatever on other terrestrial body, or not even there, even in space, in certain orbits, on Lagrange points, on prestigious real estates, if you want to say, in space. And countries or companies executing are under the supervision of the countries executing that in an unprecedented speed of development, for good or bad. I doesn't judge on that. But where is COPUOS in that? And coming back to the question, is COPUOS in this context still relevant? Hearing everything you said, can his diplomatic process keep up with the real world development?
Yeah, you know, if we could solve this issue, you know, we and everybody listening would share in the Nobel Peace Prize, because, as I said, firstly, this is the most difficult of times, and getting agreement in a non-agreement environment where you have clearly not even bipolar but multipolar perspectives, it's extremely difficult, particularly because there's a ratcheting up of rhetoric on all sides. If one says we want to dominate, we want to be the biggest and the best, others will respond clearly, and they will want to do the same thing. And we see, of course, the budgets relating to military aspects associated with space in the major countries going up and up and up. And we see in other spacefaring nations that there's a focus, you know, most of the money being spent on space technology is by the military. So clearly we cannot, Torsten, you and I, in a sense, turn that Titanic around very easily. That is the nature of the geopolitics. And, you know, it affects not only space. You know, we can't just single out space and say space is a disaster, everything is okay. This thinking is in every walk of life. Look at, you know, the conduct of warfare. Look at the, you know, the approach towards climate change. Look at the approach towards poverty and famine. Look at the approach towards international criminal justice. All of those things are challenged by politics. So space is not, you know, the only vulnerable area, but clearly it's vulnerable. It's clearly vulnerable, and you know, one has to look at it this way. And you know, many in the audience, and you, I think, might have heard me say this, but I think it bears repeating. And this is, again, my own personal perspective, and I generalize here. But I always compare the way we will act in space and its implications with another great challenge in life, which is climate change. Yeah. Now, climate change, we're all aware of the challenges. We're all aware that there's a lot of words, but sometimes not a lot of action by countries because of politics, because of a whole range of issues. We understand that. Nobody wants to accept responsibility. Nobody wants to pay for it. Nobody wants to make radical changes to their industry. Nobody wants to, you know, impose restrictions on their own industry that might put them in a competitive disadvantage to others. All of those issues. With climate change, it's a challenge, and we will all suffer with climate change. We will all suffer. And, you know, without in any way belittling the suffering that we will have in the, if you like, more industrialized world, the countries and the populations and the individuals who will suffer the most with climate change, by and large, are in the low-lying island countries, the less developed countries, those that don't necessarily have the capability, the wherewithal, the finance, the technology, the understanding to adapt to the incredibly difficult challenges that climate change might present. So we all suffer, but on a relative scale, and I know this is highly simplistic, the poorer, less developed countries, by and large, will suffer more. If we screw up in space, and by screwing up in space, if space becomes unsustainable, unsafe, insecure, unstable, all of those things that are the mantra of what we try to do at COPUOS, stability, security, safety, sustainability of space. If we screw it up in space, we will all suffer. You've heard me say before, Torsten, we'll be back in the dark ages, literally. Critical infrastructure in every country will essentially collapse, or has the potential to collapse. Mm-hmm. We will all suffer, but who will suffer the most when you think about it? And again, this relative suffering is very simplistic, and I apologize to everybody listening, but I hope this makes the point. Those that will suffer the most are the major spacefaring countries. Why? Because they have the most to lose. They have, at the moment, the greatest capabilities. That gives them the greatest competitive advantages. That gives them the possibilities to do things that perhaps some other countries can't do. But therefore, they are the most vulnerable if they cannot continue to access space in that way, because their whole system is now directed towards an assumption that they will be able to develop and build upon and utilize their space capabilities. If all of a sudden space becomes unsustainable, let us say, if the unthinkable happens and there's a war in space, there's debris, there's nuclear, electromagnetic pulses that destroy satellites, there's whatever. If that is to happen, we all suffer. We all suffer dramatically. Humanity does. But the countries that will lose the most are the largest spacefaring nations. Mm-hmm. And so, in a sense, and I know this is really taking it away from the real issue of humanity and taking it to the realism of geopolitics and international relations. When it comes down to it, that thinking is that the larger countries, in fact, all of us, but the larger countries who have terrestrial tensions, and we all are aware of those, in a sense, they have a common interest not to go beyond a certain point when it comes to space, because they're doing themselves out of their competitive advantage. Now, that's easy for me to say. That's a common sense approach. That's a hard-nosed common sense approach. We have to hope that below the rhetoric, that there are people who understand that, okay, let's beat our chest, let's be strong, let's aim to be the biggest and the best and the brightest, let's criticize the others. But let's also understand that if it's screwed up, we're going to suffer just as much as they do. If a country were to detonate a nuclear weapon with the electromagnetic pulse, it's an indiscriminate thing. It will destroy indiscriminately. It'll fry the electronics of all sorts of satellites, including their own. It will make space unsustainable. It will elicit a reaction that will make the situation even worse. And of course, there are no winners in that sort of scenario. Everybody's a loser, but the larger countries are, in a sense, the biggest losers. And I think that, unfortunately, it's not for the right reason, but it's for practical, realistic reasons. That is the hope that people realize that we can only go so far when it comes to space. This is now looking from the perspective of the larger spacefaring country. We can only go so far. Because if we go beyond a certain point, then in fact we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
I take that as an yes to the question if UN COPUOS is still relevant.
Oh, yep. Absolutely, it's relevant.
It's absolutely a right interpretation. Good. I mean,
absolutely, it's relevant. As I said, the output of COPUOS is extremely relevant in all of the different aspects of space. The fact that people are in the room discussing, tough discussions, right? Tough discussions. The fact that we have that fora for dialogue, And the dialogue is going on rather than at the CD, where really it's just, treading water because the difficult issues are not even addressed. If you look at the agenda of COPUOS, of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, the Legal Subcommittee, the issues that they're addressing are, issues that are crucial. And so, of course, it's relevant. Of course, it could be better. Of course, we all wish that states would act totally rationally and cooperatively and all be of the same voice. They're not, but we have to deal with that and try to find the best way forward.
Okay, great. Let's speed up for my last two questions that I prepared, and I hope we can wrap them up really quickly because we have a number of questions from our wonderful audience that I don't want to miss. So the next topic I had in mind 2 months ago, we had a Space Café roundtable on Artemis. So Mike Gold, who was one of the driving forces behind, positioned Artemis and the Artemis Accords, especially as an inviting, peaceful, and positive thing. Great. Over the last weeks, we have seen a number of Artemis Accords signatories rise to 40 with Lithuania. Now, yesterday it came in that Slovakia will be number 41 with their next visit. On the other side, we have ILRS, the Chinese-Russian station, with Nicaragua and Serbia signing it, I think, to 12, if I'm not mistaken. So will that divide the world again into two fundamental blocks? Or do you see any hope of a cooperation? Because in space, we all want to work together. So far, the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is clearly different groups of countries are proceeding in different ways with different projects and different ideas. But as I said before, our job from a governance perspective is to ensure, even if they're not going to necessarily cooperate, perhaps they will at least coordinate, but even if, they're in a sense competing with each other, and there might be other groups as well, competing with each other to try to do similar sorts of things. The disaster would be that they're operating under different rules. The much more ideal solution is that in the end, and that's where COPUOS is relevant, in the end, there's a forum where, of course, the Artemis countries will say, right, working group, for the principles, just copy-paste the Artemis principles. They're perfect. We've worked on it. 41 countries or whatever it is are now signatories to this non-binding arrangement. The ILRS countries will say, well, here's our idea of how space goes. The Moon Agreement countries, the 17 that are parties, will say, well, wait a minute, we've got rights under the Moon Agreement. Here's some great ideas. Every country will say, well, wait a minute, here's the Outer Space Treaty. And of course, everybody recognizes, including in Artemis, the centrality of the Outer Space Treaty. And then you've got civil society ideas. You mentioned the Hague Working Group, and there are others. So I see all of these from the perspective of what I'm trying to do in the working group. I see all of these inputs as really helpful because each of them contains well thought through and progressive ideas about what a governance framework might look like, in whatever way, shape, or form. And so I regard these all as inputs. They're all in this box of marbles of inputs that then the working group will look at. People will obviously push their own agenda as to what they think are the most important principles. But the working group will look at all these inputs. It doesn't start with an empty page. They've got all these incredible ideas, and there might be others. And out of that, we'll develop the principles. So, yes, of course, the world, this is a multipolar world. And it would be naive for us to think that everybody's going to work together on one project, as wonderful as that would be. And as much as we hope that's what space embodies. But it is a multipolar world. But at least, if they're going to do it, in separate ways, the incredibly important thing is that they're operating under the same rule book, because they're much more likely to comply and much less likely to miscalculate and misunderstand and worse. So that's all we can hope for. Yep. Although, maybe one day the world will change. We just don't know.
I agree with you. And I don't want to go into details here with safety zones, appropriation of materials and the entire list.
No.
My last question, and I hope we get a very, very quick answer before jumping on the question from our wonderful audience. Looking ahead, next month we will see in Vienna the 67th session of UN COPUOS, and a few topics on the agendas are, and I really copied them here on my notes: so ways and means of maintaining outer space for peaceful purposes, space and sustainable development, space and water, space and climate change, use of space technology in the United Nations systems, and I particularly find interesting the future role and methods of work of the committee. So many big topics here. Will we see progress and consensus this time among the 102 members? So what says your crystal ball?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful that we will. I'm very hopeful that we will. Again, nobody can be sure. Those are weighty topics, but also the role of COPUOS in plenary is to endorse what happened both at Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, where they looked at a whole range of other issues: space weather, space and nuclear power sources, the effects of constellations, on dark and quiet skies, and also the work of Legal Subcommittee, given that we've got a bit of a hiccup at the moment, but hopefully it'll be overcome, where we've looked at, space traffic management and space debris mitigation. COPUOS at plenary has all of these weighty matters, the ones you mentioned, plus endorsing what was already agreed by consensus in the subcommittee. I'm very hopeful. One has to be hopeful. We've had consensus every year. The fact that we didn't get our report at Legal Subcommittee for this one, in the scheme of things, relatively small issue, although it's a big issue to the relevant countries, that's unprecedented. That has not happened in 63 years of Legal Subcommittee. It's unfortunate. We're trying a way around it through a silent procedure on a procedural report. That's still underway, so I can't comment on that, but it's up to member states. But yeah, one has to be hopeful, Torsten. Correct. One has to be hopeful because COPUOS has delivered, albeit slowly sometimes, albeit by way of compromise. And the only reason it can't deliver in the future is that if there is a change of mindset amongst certain countries, that they don't want it to deliver. And it's in everybody's interest that it continues to do so.
And I think we will have a chance in our next gathering, what will be then a space law breakfast. So maybe to wrap up what happened at the session. So yes. Thank you very much. And now I'm handing over to Rika and getting her in for the questions from our audience. So let's see that we can work that out here, more or less. That looks good. And Rika on stage. And come on, everyone has his place now. Rika.
Hi, Rika.
Over to you.
Okay, so we have some very interesting questions in the chat. I'm just going to read one out. So David Coleman asks, what law reform is needed at the international level to enable and accelerate further exploration and human expansion into space?
Okay, should we take a few questions, Torsten, or one at a time? What's best for you?
If you have a chance, Rika, can we group them? What do you think? Or are they single standing?
I think they're slightly different from each other because Christoph's question is about resource utilization, and then there's something about Green Deal. So I think there's
thank you.
90 seconds for each. So
Thank you, David. So, David, the fundamental principles and the existing framework has served us incredibly well. It served us well, continues to serve us well, will serve us well in the future. It has meant, by and large, that space has worked, notwithstanding the unbelievable dramatic changes since the days of Sputnik until now. But, of course, as technology changes, as we're doing more and more things, as there are a greater diversity of states, as there are a greater diversity of actors, as there are more and more potential to do more and more things, the fundamental principles, which will always be there, always be relevant, always need to be complied with, it's important that we complement them with additional rules of the road in whatever way, shape, or form to provide greater specificity, greater certainty, greater guidance for specific types of activities that, let's face it, were never in the contemplation when the treaties were being drafted. So yes, we need reform. That's partly why, for example, we've got this working group on space resource activity. because the member states recognize that we need more. In addition to the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Agreement, at least for the Moon Agreement countries, they want these principles to lay the foundations, and then maybe they might want more. And we need rules about establishing a space traffic management or space traffic coordination system. We need more and more rules about how we're going to deal with large constellations of small satellites. We need more and more rules about debris. So yes, it's an ongoing process based on the foundations of what we got, but we need more.
Great, thank you. Rika, what else?
We have one from Chris. He asks, do you see a correlation between lunar resource utilization and the potential militarization of cislunar space? If yes, what are the potential scenarios as constrained by the OST and dictated by current and future space security realities? And of course, he added a quick note to that saying, and economic realism of lunar resource utilization, which is still unclear.
Okay, thank you. I mean, is there a correlation between lunar resource utilization and potential militarization? Let's hope not, but let's face the reality. If you look at the history of humanity on Earth, the vast majority of the wars and conflicts that we've had on Earth over the history of humanity have been about resources and have been about claims for areas that have resources. And so therefore, it's crucial that if we begin to feel that space also is something where we can really look at it in an exploitative way, and that has its problems as well because it changes the way we look at space. We have to respect its fragility. But if we begin to see space really as a source of resources, then we have to make sure, given the history of humanity and notwithstanding all of the provisions that already exist in the Outer Space Treaty, that there are no military activities, no military installations, no military maneuvers on a celestial body, including the moon, that there's a non-appropriation principle, that there's not a placement of certain types of weapons, all of that stuff. But we need to ensure that this common set of principles and rules under which resource utilization is undertaken is there to minimize the risks of misunderstandings and miscalculations. There's always a risk, and resources are something that countries and corporates see with dollar signs sometimes in their mind. You mentioned commercial. I think we're a long way away from, if at all, from, companies working out how they're going to make real money out of space resource utilization. There's no economic case at all, for example, let alone all the technical challenges to go to the moon saying, dig stuff up and bring it back. There's absolutely no economic case that supports this. So people are now, some are talking about the creation of a cislunar economy. Okay, you have to work out what that means and how that benefits humanity. But of course, there are many possibilities. And as our technology gets better, we shall see. But, if we begin to think of space simply as something to exploit with dollar signs in our mind, and we ignore all of the scientific, cultural, and other benefits that space offers to us. And it's tremendous in terms of what space does. But if we look at it simply in a sort of financial, commercial, resource exploitative way, well, I think that is probably not in our best interests. And we need to ensure that all of the voices about space are heard.
Thanks.
Okay, we have one last question from Valentine Eder. I'm just going to combine that. They ask if the worst scenario happens that we lose space services, wouldn't that save the Green Deal? And are we in an ethical dilemma to save space or the Green Deal?
And say that again.
Yeah. Go ahead, Rika.
Oh, the last part. Are we in an ethical dilemma to save space or the Green Deal?
Well, I think
I would like, before you answer, or Stephen, I'd like to jump in here because there was another question from Valentine about your Titanic analogy. And I want to respond to that because we can't definitely not change the course of the Titanic, of the big ship. What we can do, and I think that's our role and our responsibility, is also to shed a light on the iceberg to come. to inform before it's happened, and not just report about the accident or incident when it happened. So that is our role. That gave you some time also to think about now the answer.
I think that's a great response, Torsten. I think that's right. I'm not saying it's impossible to turn the Titanic around, but it takes an awfully long time to do that, right? We've got to, as well as foreseeing potential challenges and the risks associated with those challenges, we also have to be conscious that we still must be trying to turn Titanic around as well, but it's a lot harder. Well, I'm not a great expert on the Green Deal. What I would say, Valentin, is this, and it's lovely to see your name, and I hope you're well. Space is crucial for all of us in the way we manage the environmental challenges of Earth. Absolutely crucial. We all understand, and Torsten mentioned one of the issues at COPUOS will be space and climate change, space and water. If we lose the capacity to utilize the technology of space, then we dramatically compromise our ability to promote and take action that will hopefully support the environment of Earth. And so I see everything is interacted, but this is one of the important things about space. We're so much about the security issues of space, and of course that's important, but it's about so many other things as well. And I think we just need to ensure that we understand that space is part of every facet of our lives. And that includes the environment in which we live. That includes our rights to a healthy environment. That includes the future of humanity being able to survive on Earth. And so, I see space as a crucial part of that. I don't see it's a trade-off. I mean, I see if we lose space, then we threaten our abilities dramatically to save Earth from ourselves and save Earth from all of the excesses of ourselves. Space is an integral part of that process.
Great. Thank you very much, Steven, for your time today for the Space Café 33 plus minutes.
Plus, yeah.
So I'm heading back now to Rika. Please stay with us until we finish that. We have the upload here captured. And now I'm heading over to Rika, and we try the impossible to change the entire setting here to our next show's upcoming events. Here we are, and that's not me. Oh gosh, that looks terrible. And now, Rika.
Okay, before we say goodbye, let me remind you of some upcoming events. On the 28th of May, I'm doing my first Space Cafe Black Ops with India. So please come over. I'm talking to a very exciting guest, Ashok GV, who is a lawyer and policy expert in the Indian space system. And so please come by. From the 5th to 9th of June, Emma and Torsten are going to be at the ILA Air Show in Berlin. And then 12th and 13th of June, we are going to be the media partners for Expand EO in Brussels. 16th to 18th of June, there is the Prague Space Security Conference, which is very exciting. So please check that out. On the 18th, we have the UN OSA Lunar Sustainability Day. Torsten will be there in Vienna. There's going to be a lot more events, and we have a curated report in our weekly newsletters. So please subscribe to that. You can find the link in the chat. Also subscribe to our daily and NKS newsletters. If you want to support us for more events like this one, please go treat yourselves with something special, become a Space Watcher today, or help us in the Business Club program. For feedback, you can always check us out on X, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and Facebook for Torsten's Generation. Thank you all very much for your interest today. Thank you, Steven and Torsten, for that inspiring talk. Thank you, our dear audience, for joining us, and the tech team for the smooth operations. We hope to see you at the next event. In the meantime, visit our website and follow us on social media. And don't forget, become a Space Watcher today.
Thank you, and bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.